minutes, and I'll do my best to stick to this time limit, and considering technical issues so far, maybe we'll go through a bit quicker. We're working on CPD points for the session, so keep your eyes out for the details of that. Some changes to the FPA's policies and membership structures has meant that it wasn't quite as simple as it used to be for us to allocate CPD points. I'm recording the session, and we'll include the recording on our website for future reference. And over time, we'll be looking to create a library of recorded training sessions. So let's get into it. In terms of an agenda, or today's aims, what we're really looking to help you do here is to understand what isn't super switching advice, what your SOAs need to include, and ultimately to help you improve your super switching advice and supporting documents. Superannuation and associated accumulation and retirement advice plays a big part in Australia's financial services industry, and it makes sense that the regulators have high expectations and requirements when it comes to switching advice that can impact on the quality of Australians' retirement conditions. In today's agenda, we'll look briefly at the background of super switching and what isn't super switching advice, and I'll spend more time on demonstrating a reasonable basis for super switching advice, including examples of good advice and what tools FSA has developed to support the advice. Now, I was going to get everyone to jump in and put a little drawing on where they are around the country, just as a nice little bit of an icebreaker, but we'll skip through that in the interest of time this morning. And I won't spend a whole lot of time going into the detail here on the background to super switching. But you can see that the requirements excuse me, that are now in place developed from a combination of ASIC's Regulatory Guide 84, the outcomes of its shadow shopping exercise in 2006, and then following that a variety of regulatory action and FPSA experience as well. So before we get into the main part of the presentation, I'd like to touch on a couple of terms that I'll use throughout this morning's session. When I say from fund, what I'm talking about there is the existing super fund that's already open and holds some of the client's funds, if not all. And when I talk about the to fund, this means the target or recommended super fund. So I'll use those terms as we go through quite a few times this morning. The main factors that decide whether something is super switching advice are choice and advice, and the two of those working together. The super switching requirements only apply where choice is available to the client to choose their super fund, and that there's also advice provided that guides that decision. So let's look at some examples of what is super switching. So as I said before, client choice and advice to switch. So for example, super switching is advice to consolidate superannuation funds, whether that's consolidation of a number of them or partial or complete rollovers of super. Also changing superannuation provider in going from accumulation to pension mode, opening a new account for SG contributions. It's interesting to have a look at that key concept that I've mentioned at the bottom there, and this is taken straight from ASIC's regulatory guide, but it's when I talk about the concepts of advice and choice, it's also the overall impression created by your advice that determines if it's super switching. So on purely on the SOA, for example, it might not look like there's super switching advice. For example, if there's just and I'll get onto one of the examples on the next slide as to what isn't super switching, but you might have one of those scenarios, and the advice might look just on the documents not to be super switching advice. However, if there has been, there might be marketing material provided that could sway the client's opinion in regards to changing super funds, and it appears that there was maybe not direct personal advice, but an intention or an impression given that the client should switch super funds, then advice may be, or circumstances may be determined that super switching advice has been provided. So that's what I mean about the key concept of the overall impression. So keep that in mind as we go through some of the examples here. But what isn't super switching advice? And why I highlight this is knowing what isn't super switching advice is important because it can save you a lot of time in terms of what needs to go into the SOA. So I put up these examples to show you when something is super switching advice and when something, just as importantly, isn't. So if a client's forced to leave a super fund, that is not, and that may be through a change of employment or a fund closure, that's not super switching advice. If a client tells you that they have already decided to switch super funds, that also can be what ASIC calls in its regulatory guide advice that's limited to the true fund. So the client's made up their mind to leave and only wants true fund advice, or actually I'll stick with that first point. So the client makes up their mind they want to leave and they only want the true fund advice. What I would recommend in those cases, and that's a legitimate non-super switching situation, I would recommend that you dig a little bit deeper there and find out how the client has made that decision. So see if they've made up their mind based on, I don't know, something like the past performance of the fund, or is it advice from a friend or a relative, or some other factors that maybe aren't necessarily reliable, and it's in the client's best interest to actually get advice from you and to get super switching advice. So just check that they're actually making I guess a reasonably informed decision or a sensible decision. So I covered the first 2 points there. If the client's going from accumulation into drawdown phase and the options to draw down that they need actually aren't in the fund, and I think there are still some examples in the industry there where this is applicable, but there isn't a transition to retirement option available, or there's no account-based pension option available, that would not be a super switching scenario. Also, if there's comparison-only advice without switching recommendations. So if a client's looking really just for someone to give them a snapshot of what are the features and costs associated with my existing fund versus another fund, but there's not specific advice to actually change, then that would be not counted as super switching advice. If it is only true fund advice, or if it's not, generally one of these other situations, it wouldn't be considered super switching advice. Important to document the basis for that, and just to make sure that the records you keep, so essentially file notes of meetings with clients, show that, you know, in the case of true fund advice, that your client asked for advice limited to the true fund. And the SOA should clearly tell the client that the advice is limited to that you're only advising them about the true fund and that you're not comparing the to and from funds. Something else that's not super switching advice is choosing or changing investment options within the one super fund as well, so underlying fund switches. So again, documenting the basis for that true fund advice is important, and again, remember that the overall impression created by your advice will determine if it's super switching advice. So ASIC has stated that it'll also look closely, and we would follow the same path. Would look closely at files of advisors seem to have a number of clients who only want advice about the true fund, although they may still be eligible to remain in their from fund. So we'd also look at closely at files of clients who have where there's large numbers of clients only wanting advice limited to comparative information. So that's where we look at the overall impression to make sure that they're actually legitimate non-super switching advice situations. So we've been through a couple of examples of where what is and what isn't super switching. So hopefully this works better than the actual than the drawing feature I was going to enable. But we're going to try a quick poll here. So what I'm going to turn on the menu to the side of your webinar here is a quick poll, and what you'll see pop up is a scenario, and really we're looking at answering the question of whether this is or isn't super switching advice. So in this case,